This podcast is brought to you by Crack the OAT. Crack the OAT is an online study program designed for pre-optometry students looking to be successful on the OAT. This program includes full-length exams, video lectures covering the subjects on the test, and readily available tutors to help you along the way. If you're looking to be a part of this supportive community or you're looking at your options for studying, stay tuned for the discount code I will be giving for 10% off the program later in this podcast. Hey everyone, it's Marielle, and this is your second episode of Opt-In. In this episode, we are talking with Kristen Tobin, the Director of Admissions at New England College of Optometry in Boston, and we're talking about the interview process. We're comparing this year's interview process from years before and giving tips for students preparing for interviews to come. So let's dive right in.
How's your day been?
It's been good.
Good.
It's just the morning, so.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah, I mean, I turned an application, so that's a whole nother thing. But it's a relief. But let's go ahead and let's get into it. So the topic we're going to be covering today is the interview. Obviously, all the schools right now are having virtual interviews, and it may be different. And so if things are specific to NECO, that's totally fine.
Okay.
And if you want to generalize it, you can.
Okay, great. I can do a little bit of both.
Awesome. So let's start out with introducing yourself and what your role is at NECO.
Sure. Hello, my name is Kristen Tobin. I am the Director of Admissions at New England College of Optometry, otherwise known as NECO. We're located in Boston, Massachusetts. My background is admissions. I've been working in admissions with students for over 15 years, and I have been specifically working with optometry students at NECO for a little over 6 years now.
Great. Okay, and then so let's start from scratch. I want to start from pre-interview. So once someone turns in their application on OptumCast, which is the application portal, when should they expect an interview offer if they get an interview? And does this vary depending on the month? Another question following up with that is there a higher chance of students getting an interview or receiving an interview the earlier you apply? Because I know for almost every school now is rolling. So.
Yes. So as some of you may know, the OptumCast application normally goes live the end of June every year. So as optometry schools, we start receiving applications around July 1st or a couple of days after that. You should know that when you apply, it does take a couple days for OptumCast to verify your application. It's normally pretty quick. We used to tell students a week to 2, but normally from what I've seen, within like 3 to 5 days, once you submit your transcripts, the colleges that you've expressed interest in should be able to start reading your materials. I know with NECO, as we receive complete verified applications, we'll read them and we'll let students know right away that we received your application. And then if we think you're a strong candidate, within a few days, we would also invite you to interview. And then at that point, we normally interview as early as August through April, and those are on a rolling basis. So applications will continue to come in. We try to read them as quick as possible, respond quickly, invite for interview. If we aren't sure about inviting someone or we need some more information, we'll let students know right away about that as well. So sometimes we'll hold an application, for instance, for a student who's retaking the OAT, or maybe a student is in the middle of taking coursework. We might say, okay, thanks so much. Can you send us your fall semester grades, and then we'll review it. In terms of the cycle with rolling admissions, that's one of the questions I get asked the most is, should I apply early? Do I have a better shot? And all the colleges are currently rolling admissions. And my answer to that personally is that earlier is better, but what I consider early might be a little different. I think trying to rush your application in July, if you're not ready, especially trying to rush taking the OAT, is not a great idea. I think it's better to, take a little extra time. I know I tell students that even December or January for us is fine. Our deadline is March 31st. So we're kind of at the point where, November, December is about the midway point. So at that way, we're still accepting applications. We still interview through the end of April. So, I do think if you're ready earlier, you can submit it, that's great. the thing I recommend to students is, even if you're not ready to apply early in the cycle, I recommend reaching out to the admissions offices, introducing yourself. If you have any questions, letting them know. Because a lot of times I'll have students reach out to me even as early as a year or two before they're applying, but that way we can get to know them, we can advise them. Because, when I hear from a student for the first time, say in February and March, and maybe they could have used to retake a course, or they're missing a recommendation, and even if they hadn't applied earlier, we could have at least been having that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. That's good to know, because I know some people have that stress of, I need to apply right when the application starts, but that is good advice to wait until you're actually ready. I know it's something that people tell us all the time, but it's definitely hard to get in your head when you have that time pressure.
Yeah, and
Um,
it's a balance. And the other thing I always say is, it is worth asking the different schools, but
mhm.
in general, most of us have deadlines. I think, the earliest is January or February. So, it's worth reaching out. But I do think, especially with the OHE, I've worked with numerous students over the years who have felt the pressure to take it early, whereas even 3 or 4 extra weeks of studying might have helped them. And
Mhm.
at least on our end, my recommendation is always take that time. Set yourself up for as much success as you can. But if in doubt, reach out to your individual schools and ask them, because their, advice might vary a little bit from school to school.
And so when students get an offer for an interview, how does that look like on an email, and how do they sign up for like an interview date?
Sure. So, in looking at working with other schools and students, I would say most of us do try to turn around interview invites pretty quickly, and most schools offer them on a rolling basis. I know for us at NECO, and this was the case before COVID and during COVID as well, we always offer multiple dates. So students will get an email saying, we'd like you to interview, linking them to our portal with a calendar. And I know for us, we usually interview twice a week, usually Mondays and Fridays. So students can pick one that week. They can pick one in a month from now. They can kind of do it based on their schedule. I found this year people are scheduling them probably a little sooner because they don't have to book travel, whereas in the
Mhm.
past they might have to book a flight. But we always give multiple options. I believe that's the case for most, if not all, programs. And then, students will pick a date, and from then we'll send them confirmation information. NECO's interviews currently are on Zoom. We're doing not a full day, but we're doing not just a one-off interview. We're doing a day where students, join us around 10 a.m. They hear from admissions, they meet our president, they still kind of get an informal student panel and trying to do some form of a tour, even though
Mhm.
remote. We do one-on-one interview with a faculty member. They meet one of our clinicians. So they are on Zoom for a few hours when they book that time block and get that information.
Got it. Yeah, that was actually my next question, is how the interview day looks like during the pandemic and how things are looking this year, and maybe comparing it to the years before, just in case people listen to this in the coming years when there's an actual in-person.
Sure, sure. I think the biggest thing I would say about at least our process at NECO in terms of interviewing is that we really want it to be a conversation. When we invite someone to interview, we don't take it lightly. To us, that means that we see a lot of potential in that candidate. So we do a really thorough screen. It's a holistic review. We read your essays, we look at your scores, your grades, your recommendations, all of that. And then we invite people to interview that based on the paper we think might be a great fit for our program. So in terms of the way we approach the interview, we, for us, really want it to feel more like a conversation, however possible. So we think it's important that students have the opportunity to meet multiple NECO students and hopefully different years. A first year student's going to have a different perspective, than a third year
Mhm.
student. We hope to have you have this one-on-one faculty interview. Has always been our approach. We think it's a good way to have a conversation. For us, we see it as a laid-back opportunity, not something that should be scary, but something that really is just a chance to get to know if a student is a good fit for our institution. We always like to be able to show off our facilities, if possible. We have a beautiful campus in Boston. We have a really great brand new clinical training center and clinic. So we love to get students into those spaces, to see them, to meet one of the practicing ODs and have them talk a little bit about patient care. Our president attends 99% of our interview days. 1%, there's always 1 or 2 days a year, but for him, it's also really important he wants to greet students. He wants to learn, why they chose optometry, tell them about his experience. NECO's a small place. We're a family. So for us, the interview day is really an opportunity both to get to know the student, but we really hope that ultimately a student will leave that day having a sense of who we are and if we're potentially a good fit. One thing I always tell students is there's really no bad choice with optometry school, and I sincerely believe that. The 23 programs are all wonderful. I've had the chance to visit many schools, and I've always been really impressed with the programs. And I think it really kind of comes down to personality and approach, both for the student and the school. So hopefully the interview day process is something that helps answer questions on both sides.
Got it. So you were saying how students usually get a chance to talk to different students from different years and faculty members. Is that the same this year? Is it like multiple mini interviews, or is it one like 30 to an hour interview with everyone, or how does that work?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. This year, one thing that I would say is different is when students are on campus, the first thing they do in the morning is they mingle with each other and with multiple NECO students. And then when they're taking a tour, they're kind of off with maybe another NECO student or two, and they're walking around. So this year we have this kind of student panel piece. So that's one thing that's a little trickier. It's a little bit more of a formal, you're sitting with students, you're asking questions. So one piece that we're trying to find other ways to kind of recreate is that informal part of the day where you're just chatting. And one thing we're working on scheduling, if students want, prospective students, is that they can schedule kind of a one-off chat with an ECHO student in the evening, or just because we know it's a little harder in Zoom when there's multiple other students on there. So I would say that's probably the biggest difference, are those informal conversations. Our interview is always one-on-one, so it's always just one faculty member, which is why we've always had an additional faculty clinician do a clinical overview. When we're on campus, they actually walk you through our clinic and our pre-clinic and point things out. And then they are the same kind of faculty member, or they rotate through. We still have a clinician that joins the virtual Zoom. So at a minimum, you're meeting the president, you're meeting your faculty interviewer, and you're meeting one of our ODs. So at least you kind of have that perspective throughout the day as well.
Okay. And so being that it's all online now, are there any do's or don'ts that come to mind, or anything that, students should refrain from, like backgrounds or things like that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. My general advice for interviews beforehand is just to sit down, and it sounds really simple, but to think about, why you chose optometry and why you're interested in that program. So kind of going into it just to have that top of mind. In terms of online interviews, whether they're Zoom or another platform, I do think it's worth just ahead of time making sure you can log in, make sure there's nothing you have to download, testing your audio, your mic, thinking about what's in your background, obviously, knowing that you're going to be interviewing, whether you decide to use a virtual background. Most students I've worked with don't. They're in a room in their house or something, and that's absolutely fine. You just want to be aware of what's behind you. Normally what even is if I'm going to have a big meeting, sometimes I'll log on earlier in the day and just check out, okay, what's the lighting, what's behind me, oh, my kids' toys are there, let me make sure I move those out. So I think that's always helpful. The other thing I would keep in mind is that even though it's Zoom, it's still a professional interview. You still want to make sure you're on time. It's still the same kind of formal process where, being there on time, listening and asking questions, that keeping in mind that you'd want to kind of approach it the same way you would if you were on campus, which I know can be tricky, but I think it's helpful to keep that in mind.
Okay. Yeah. So I was thinking about it because I know people talk about body language and eye contact and attire, and I think it's so different for everyone this year, especially with Zoom, like looking at the video versus the camera and things like that.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, the other advice I would give, or what I would share, is that we, as both admissions people and as faculty and staff at optometry schools, we get it. I mean, we're all living in the same reality as well. So we understand that this is not a normal situation for anyone to have to be, trying to look at videos and Zoom. And so I think people are really trying to be flexible. In general, across the optometry schools, the admissions offices have been meeting to help talk about what are we doing about the fact students can't get as much shadowing. We know students are struggling getting their exams taken. Students are dealing with stressors that they don't normally have. And then the interview piece is just another layer. How do we live in this world where we can't have this one-to-one communication? What I can tell students is the advice or the feedback I've received from students, and we've been doing virtual interviews for gosh, 4 or 5 months now, is that they still feel like they've been able to feel laid back. They still feel like they're being able to engage. So, you know, it's easy for me to say try not to worry too much, but I really think in general, optometrists and faculty at optometry schools are very friendly people. In general, the interview days across the schools, that's the feedback I hear, that students really enjoy them. So try not to get too caught up in it. Remember that the other person might be also equally uncomfortable to be staring at themselves on Zoom. So I think as long as we all approach this as we're all in it together, then it will all work out well.
Right. And we mentioned it before. There are multiple things that students should keep in mind before their interview. But in addition to that, are there any tips you can provide that may enhance a student's interview experience?
Yeah, no, I think preparing some questions, and again, I can't guarantee that that's going to be the case everywhere, but I know for us, we're always impressed when students have some thoughtful questions where they've done their homework. You don't need to know everything about scope of practice in optometry or everything about our individual program, but it is nice that that you've done a little bit of background, and to also kind of understand your perspective of why you're choosing the profession, and why you're applying to our school. So I do think, coming prepared with some questions, it's really cheesy, but my biggest advice is to be yourself. The real purpose of an interview, and I've sat around the table with admissions colleagues, or I should say faculty colleagues on the admissions committee, is a lot of what they're talking about is, can we see this person in clinic? Can this person relate to patients? Can this person relate to people? Do we think they could communicate well? So, when you're coming to your interview, as much as you can be friendly, you can be engaged, and that's not one size fits all. I look at even just the students who work, say, in our office in admissions, who are optometry students. Some of them are very introverted, some of them are very quiet, some of them talk endlessly. It's not one size fits all, but I do think that, coming into the interview engaged, being friendly, being polite, follow up with a thank you note, sending an email thank you note. Again, not required, but it always goes over well. And some of the times I think faculty are especially impressed is if there's something in particular, that came up in your interview. Maybe you were talking about, something to do with pediatrics, or something came up about, a mutual experience you and the interviewer have, or anything like that. Being able to write back, say thank you, and also reference, you especially appreciated that piece of the conversation. That's something that's always impressive.
Okay. That's good to keep in mind for the students that are interviewing in the next coming months, including myself. And so I don't know if you can answer this question, but I did have it down. So during an interview for NECO, I know you say you're starting at like 10 a.m. and doing an admissions talk. And I just want to ask, like, what should students expect going from that initial kind of informational video or meeting to the interview? And then if if there are any sample questions you can maybe present to us that students, should maybe prepare for, expect at maybe any optometry school.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the moving, like how it works technology wise.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So in terms of the interviews, I know at NECO we're using Zoom, and we're not currently using breakout rooms because we had some issues. So we give people a general Zoom that the majority of the group part of the day is there. So the welcome, the meeting with the president, the student panel, the clinic overview, that's all one link. And then we give them a separate link, which is their interview. So at one point they do sign off and sign into their interview
Okay.
and come. And so the interview link is just for the interviewer and the student. And for us, that's worked out well. We've toyed with the idea of having breakout rooms, but again, there's kind of
Mm-hmm.
pros and cons to everything we found with technology. So it depends on the school. I know some schools are doing just the interview, and then they're doing information sessions where people can log in like once a week. Like, everyone's got a little bit of a different approach to it. And I think we're all using different platforms to a sense. So Zoom seems to be the most popular one
Mm-hmm.
that people are using. The other question was, interview questions. Yeah, I can definitely and give some questions or things to think about. And if any of you are not on Student Doctor Net, there's always a lot on
Oh
there.
yeah.
I look at it too, because I'm always curious what's out there. But it seems really basic, but I would be prepared to answer why optometry. and to talk about your experience. And it's not one size fits all. And I say that about the personal statement too. You know, there's not one correct answer, but being prepared to talk about, you know, what interested you. Maybe there's experiences along the way, whether it be shadowing, whether it be something in your own personal experience, whether it be something you did that you didn't like that led you to this, whatever it is, you know, be prepared to answer that. And I do think being prepared to answer why you're applying to whatever the given program is. I think people they're not trying to catch you. They're just curious. You know, the programs are like I mentioned, the programs are all great, but we have a little bit of differences in our approaches and everything. So I think it's helpful to understand, you know, what a student's looking for. The other thing I would be prepared to address, I would say at any school, though you may not get asked, is to address maybe any challenges you've had academically. You know, one question that we ask all of our applicants is if there's any extenuating circumstances they want us to know about. And that's something we ask in the application itself. We don't ask it in the interview, but I know oftentimes in the interview we'll want to know from the student's perspective of anything academically or in their history that they think maybe isn't consistent with the rest of it, or something that's been especially challenging. And it's really helpful, especially if, you know, maybe you have someone who's really struggled with their grades during a semester or two in college, or they struggled with a portion of the OAT or whatever that is. It's a good opportunity for the student just to give a little bit more background. And then when we're able to then meet as an admissions committee, if the interviewer can then share kind of a little bit more about what the student's experience was, and ultimately what we're trying to get at is, will this student be successful? And so that does not mean that someone has to come in as a straight A applicant. What we are looking for is that someone is reflective. You know, they've been able to reflect on any challenges they've had. We're also looking for students that are going to be, you know, they're going to be motivated, but they're also going to be willing to ask for help and maybe alter the way they study. You know, graduate school is different from undergraduate school. So I think as a student, thinking about, you know, what is it that I think I'm going to need to be successful in optometry school? Why do I think I'm prepared? You know, what about my history has prepared me well? And then just thinking about, is there anything in my application that if I was someone on the outside that I might be a little concerned about? And it's never to try to trick someone, but it's more just us trying to gauge, you know, someone's potential. The last thing we ever want to do is set someone up to be unsuccessful. And there's no guarantee any candidate. But those are some of the things we're looking for, is just someone's ability to maybe speak to some of the challenge they've had, and to get a sense for, you know, if the student were to join our program and they were to struggle, which everybody does at some point, how are they going to react, and what resources might they take advantage of in that situation?
Got it. Well, that's really good advice. I think that is very similar to a question I think a lot of people get asked in an interview, like, kind of what are your strengths and weaknesses, and people are like, what are my weaknesses, and kind of try to think about it that way. But I did like that you mentioned when you were explaining why optometry, that you said something along the lines of because I think I personally refrain from it, talking about other professions, or like, oh, I, you know, ran into optometry because I found out I didn't like X, Y, and Z. And I wanted to ask you if that, I guess not comes up often, but if that's okay to talk about. And then also, I know I've been to optometry camps at some other schools, and they're always, some students are like, never talk about another school during their interview, things like that. Is that something to be cautious of, like other professions and other schools?
You know, in terms of students thinking about other professions and other schools, in my mind, you know, students are human beings who have explored. It's not one size fits all. I'm under the assumption that every student I'm working with has always known they wanted to be an optometrist and is only applying to my program. In fact, if a student were to tell me they were only applying to my program, I would recommend they apply to at least a few others, because I think it's really important. Not that I would love everyone to end up with us, but, you know, I think it's important to explore different options. In terms of the interview and even the essay for optometry school, I think it's fine to mention that you had other interests. The only place I would see potentially a concern, and I don't think I've ever seen this, but for example, if a student were to come in and say, well, I was going to go to med school, but I didn't get accepted, so now I'm here. Something like that. But I've worked with a lot of students who, for instance, let's use ophthalmology. Say I was thinking the eyes, and I was thinking I wanted to be an MD or surgery, and then I I realized that, in shadowing optometrists, they get to build much stronger relationships with patients, and they see their patients over a year over year, where ophthalmology, it's really they're in and out. Like something that's a great explanation of a way that you learned, okay, that's one way to do it, but I am actually someone who wants patient care. So thus I was attracted to this. And I think it's okay in your journey. I think as long as students have a solid reason why they're doing this, which in my experience most do, it's never that question. I mean, there's always going to be that I won't say concern, but I do think that, faculty or admissions people are trying to understand, does someone really want to do this? Again, in my experience, I don't often question that, but I think, whether it was learning about other professions and stumbling upon it, what I would say is ultimately important is making the why. Why I didn't do that, or why it brought me here. And then also trying to take it from a positive perspective. I think, and that's something in an application in general, like I hated dentists or something, well, but saying, I looked at pharmacy and I looked at dental, but I loved what was a positive about optometry was XYZ. And other schools, if it comes up in an interview where else you're applying or where else you're interested, I think it's absolutely fine to share. I don't think there's any downside, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. I mean, I guess if I was in an interview, I might not be like actively bring it up necessarily. Yeah. But I mean, a lot of times I know when I'm meeting with prospective students, I ask them where else they're applying just because I'm curious. Like, oh, do you want to stay on the coast? Or you're thinking about, you want to relocate. So so sometimes it's just informal conversation. It isn't because I'm trying to, check out the competition or anything.
Okay. Yeah, that's good advice for people to know. I know there's just so much stress behind the interview. I think I want to relieve a little bit and, in a talk with you, and hopefully students can find this on Spotify and Apple Music and stuff. Hopefully it's easy to find, but I think that's really useful tips. And just my last question is, any last tips for interview students that have interviews coming up, or if you could leave them with one piece of advice to prepare for interviews?
Yeah, as you're thinking about upcoming interviews, I think the first thing I would say is try to take a deep breath. I think with this whole process, there is so much anxiety. This is one of the most important decisions you're trying to make in your life, and we understand that as well. But know that we're here to support you. The way that optometry admissions offices and optometry faculty and admissions committees approach this process is they're looking for future colleagues. We're a small profession, we're a tight-knit profession, and that's how they enter into these interviews. They're not trying to say, oh, is this going to be my top student? Like, obviously we want to recruit people that are going to do well academically, but they're really thinking more holistically than that. We're looking for human beings that are really passionate about patient care, about eye care. So coming into it, I think keeping in mind that instead of thinking about it as, oh, how are they going to be out to get me? Like, think about, they're going to be here trying to support me and to try to figure out if this is going to be a good fit for both of us. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that it's really important for you to get your questions answered and for you to get a sense for the place you're looking at. And maybe if you think that way, it takes a little of the pressure off of, oh, it's just about me getting checked out. The other thing I would keep in mind is that all of us as schools, we do vet students before we ask you to interview. And you can be pretty darn sure that if a school has asked you to interview, that there's someone that they would absolutely consider for acceptance. So, going in with that mindset that, okay, I'm interviewing here because this school believes that I might be a great fit, and now it's just a conversation. I guess my last piece of advice, and it's cheesy, but I mean it, is to be yourself, to not try to feel like you have to come up with some story or some great answer just to have it. I think what resonates is people that can be, articulate the why, but also that are authentic. I think that's what comes through in an interview is not that you have the craziest story or the most shadowing hours or the highest OAT scores. It's people who can come in and show that they're good communicators and are good, hopefully compassionate human beings that are really excited about being great doctors.
Yeah, I think that this is a great way to end the podcast, to leave our listeners with that last piece of advice. So thank you again for helping me make this happen and giving your insight to us on this podcast. I really hope students find this helpful. I know I've been saying that so many times, but I really hope it does. So thank you again so much. All right, well, there you have it. Our second episode is done. I hope you guys all found this helpful in some way, shape, or form. If you liked it, definitely like us on Instagram and give us a follow at Opt-In Podcast. And you can also send us an email if you want to send us any recommendations for episodes you would like to hear. Our email is crackoat@gmail.com. And again, like I mentioned earlier in the podcast, we are giving a 10% discount code off our product. And that discount code is OPTINWITHNECO. I'll include that in the bio for this podcast episode. So go ahead and look there if you didn't catch that this time. Otherwise, thank you again for listening, and we hope you stay tuned for our next episode.